You're listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, brought to you by NES Design and Construction and hosted by Nicola Spurling on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples. Hello, this is a social justice podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Spurling, and today I'm joined by Vee Greer for a conversation about hearing impairment. Vee, thank you for joining the podcast.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And can you introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, sure. So I'm currently a practicing counseling therapist. I mainly practice with neurodivergent and by coincidence, lots of queer and trans people as well. I myself am trans. I came out in late 2016, early 2017, and I work a lot to support people who need it in trauma therapy and other areas. I'm currently in my third year of social work degree at University Victoria. I recently found in the last year or two that I'm starting to lose my hearing, and I also was diagnosed with audio processing disorder. And so I find a lot of people don't know much about it, and generally kind of the struggles of hearing loss as well. And so I'm working on helping more people understand it and, kind of the accessibility in general.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to help folks understand this. And I'm curious to know about your journey and how hearing loss became a part of your life. You said that that began about a year and a half ago that you started discovering this. What were some symptoms that popped up that made you think that this was something you needed to look into? What has that been like for you, discovering that you have this hearing impairment, and how is that impacting your life?
Yeah, well, I mean, it turns out I have had audio processing disorder all my life and just didn't realize it. So, audio processing disorder, for people who don't realize or don't know much about it, is it's difficulty with understanding and interpreting sounds. So, with the hearing mechanisms, you've got a physical hearing like the ear, the outer ear, the middle ear, inner ear, etc., all of the physical parts. And then, of course, the handoff to the neurological, once it's turned into neurological signals, then parts of the brain work to understand and decode what you've heard. The audio processing disorder is a neurological condition where there's deficits in understanding or interpreting sounds, especially something called speech in noise. So if you're out at a restaurant or in a crowded area and there's noise going on in the background, most people can differentiate, like there's noise in the background, but the person right in front of them, they can pull that sound out and tune out the rest. It is quite common for neurodivergent folks to struggle with that, and so there is quite an overlap with neurodivergence and audio processing disorder. However, not a lot is known about it yet. There's still a lot of research going on about APD, as I will abbreviate it with. Some people might, feel like, trying to pull different sounds out from each other is like really grating on this nervous system and really difficult to understand. Some people describe that, speech in a crowd all blends together, or various sounds, instead of sounding different from each other and being able to focus on different sounds, that, if there's a TV on in the background and somebody's talking, that those sounds just blend together and you can't differentiate them. And therefore it just turns to static, and it's like I can't distinguish what's this and what's that and everything else. It all blends together. And so that's generally what audio processing disorder is. And then, of course, like I've had some hearing loss. I'm currently going through tests to see whether it was actually caused by COVID.
Oh, wow.
Because I got COVID the first time in 2023, and it was shortly after that I had my first hearing test that I failed. And then I had COVID again in June of 2024, and then another hearing test that's annual after that, and my hearing loss had gone down again.
Wow.
It could be coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's still
Yeah.
so much we don't know about the effects of COVID. And obviously,
Yeah. Yeah.
your personal experience with hearing impairment is with, I guess, a condition that is not particularly well researched either. So trying to figure out what's going on there must be quite a challenge. What motivated you to want to have this particular conversation on a podcast where hearing is somewhat essential for digesting information?
It is. Um, Many people with audio processing disorder don't struggle with hearing one sound. They struggle when there's overlap. Um, so like one person talking in a quiet environment, easy.
Mhm.
Although sometimes over my life, I've noticed that like sometimes somebody will say something to me and it's like a glitch and it went in one ear and out the other type of thing. That can also be an audio processing disorder thing, which I didn't realize. I thought it was just, oh, my attention kind of gapped and I need to ask somebody to repeat. But it's still that the brain, I physically heard you, but the brain didn't grasp onto it. And so now I have no idea what you just said. And so I'm having to ask somebody to repeat. Some people with audio processing disorder describe, kind of randomly people sounding like they're underwater or other things that still speak to like a lack of the brain's ability to interpret or decode. Um, and what we also find is people with autism get sensory overload because there's like, beeping sounds going on and somebody's trying to talk to them and there's too many sounds going on. Audio processing disorder. So again, it's kind of like it's one of the symptoms that can be present within the autism spectrum, and just people don't realize it. So I figured this might be an interesting option to come on and talk about it and spread some awareness, and especially when it relates to accessibility, because when most people think of hearing issues, the only thing they know about is the hearing loss, the physical going deaf or hard of hearing, etc. Right?
Mhm.
Um, so there's less knowledge about this.
Right.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
speaking of people not necessarily having enough knowledge, what do you think are some of the things that people misunderstand the most about hearing impairment?
A multitude of things, I'm sure, that there is misunderstood. Um, it's hard for people in a hearing world to understand what happens when you have a sense taken away, right? Years and years ago, I was in a community that looked after people with disabilities, and one of the trainings that they had their people go through who would come in and volunteer to help look after the people with various neurodevelopmental disabilities was they would have the volunteers spend a day either without hearing, like simulated, earplugs and things like this, and try and get through a whole day where you cannot hear anybody or anything, or um, spend a whole day with a blindfold on where you can't see anything and you have to rely on other people and things like this. And so that was just one small sample of like living with a different disability. Obviously, there's tons and tons of disabilities. There's physical disabilities, there's emotional and mental disabilities, there's all sorts. We know this. However, I think it's very valuable for people to have to put themselves in other people's shoes just to even try and get some experience like that. Although it's not always possible. But as for your question, like what do people misunderstand? That's hard because I'm not sure everything that people misunderstand, but some of
Of
the
course.
common things can be like, okay, I was in a class at UVic and the instructor, we use speech in our world and society and we don't always even think about it. And so our instructor who knows that I'm in the class and that I use a transcriber who transcribes the speech and I read it on my laptop just to help me pick up on everything that's being said and especially in group discussions. Um, and So our instructor told everybody like, hey, let's do some mindfulness. Everybody close your eyes and just listen. And I looked and I went, um, you didn't think about that, did you? You know? And
Hmm.
my instructor, it took a minute and then I saw the penny drop and, oh, right, people talk about feeling heard, feeling listened to, all of these things. Like language in general, doesn't always um, reflect different abilities. And of course, we know what people mean. It's just about bringing awareness to other experiences.
Right.
Um, yeah. I'm currently trying to bring awareness to something called the Hidden Disabilities Sunflower Campaign,
Oh, what is that?
which I I forgot to mention it to you, but the Hidden Disabilities Sunflower is you can Google it. Lots of people can Google it, but like basically it's a lanyard that has green with yellow sunflowers on it, and it's now known as the Hidden Disabilities Sunflower. And sometimes people at the end of the lanyard can have a card that says like, I have this difficulty or that difficulty. But the key is that the lanyard itself is just meant to alert somebody to the fact that this person may have a hidden disability, even though they appear to, be able to physically walk or this and that, um, and various international airports. I first encountered it at Toronto International Airport. However, various international airports are signing up. Various public facilities are signing up for it, and they'll have these lanyards out, and they're free to take. And also, they will train their staff to recognize, that if they see that lanyard, it may mean that like somebody may have a need that isn't apparent.
Mm.
So that can also be a thing.
Right. That probably really helps with that self-advocacy piece because it can be quite
Yes.
difficult to have to advocate for yourself every time you're dealing with a situation because people aren't seeing that you're in need of assistance.
I've
Um,
often wanted people to, like, blind people have a cane, deaf people don't have anything visual. I've been walking down the street and somebody yelled at me and I didn't hear them. And then they came up to me and started yelling at me because I was being rude and I wouldn't give them the time of day.
mm,
I had no idea that they were saying anything. And
right.
so, like, deaf people don't have a visual aid, and many other hidden disabilities don't either. So, yeah.
Mhm. And people probably only think of that because of, jokes that they'll see online where someone starts talking to a person who can't hear
Yeah.
and there's some sort of humorous interaction because of it, but it's not necessarily because of a real life experience that they've had, and they probably don't know how to react in that situation because real life and TV or social media is not always good to line up. Speaking of ways that you can help people who have hearing impairment, there's a lot of interesting technology out there, and obviously technology is always being developed. Are there any specific tools or devices that have really made a difference for you or maybe for others with hearing impairment?
For hearing loss or deafness or hearing impairment in that capacity, then of course there's interpretation, there's transcription, I have an app on my phone that's like I can tap it and it will transcribe using, kind of rough guesses. It's usually 90% accurate, could be less depending on somebody's speech patterns. But like there's lots of accessible tools. However, the biggest thing to bring people's awareness to is that for audio processing disorder being slightly different than physical hearing loss, there is no necessary cure. There are things that can help, but there is no fix,
Mhm.
which, by the way, I will mention anybody with audio processing disorder that is bad enough to interfere in their daily life makes anybody with that eligible for the disability tax credit because it's a condition that cannot be fixed with hearing aids.
Mm,
Just
right.
putting it out there.
That is a great tip for someone
Yes,
listening who
yes,
may not know that.
yes. And so, uh, also, we find that there needs to be more research into this, and I'm hoping to kind of like that more places will pick up on this. But like for children with audio processing disorder um, in schools or things like this, um, it can help to have simultaneous types of communication. So either something called SimCom, which is like sign language, but with English grammar. So basically using signs while talking, which is not ASL, it's called SimCom, or um, transcription, other things like this. Having multiple inputs to rely on can assist with audio processing disorder, which is why I have transcription in classes.
Right. And as far as sort of what accessibility in the world looks like these days, what would you say are some things that we as a society are doing well? What might need some improvement?
As a society, we're slowly working towards, being more accessible. As you'll notice, the BC government and such now have sign language interpretation with press releases and other things. I'm pushing for my municipality in Esquimalt to also have sign language interpretation at public municipal events or things like this. There is a shortage of interpreters. However, the more we push for it, hopefully the more there will be. Just kind of the more people become educated, if people are hearing and, start understanding and being able to think about like different disabilities, it can help.
Right, absolutely. So you're talked about interpreters at government functions, I suppose. Now, is that related to the Canadian Accessibility Act that we were talking about before this podcast began?
Yes, yeah. So the most people know about the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. The Canadian Accessibility Act came into law in 2019 and started to be implemented shortly after that, um, at the beginning of the pandemic and through the pandemic, which is why we saw sign language interpretation alongside, COVID broadcasts for, from the government and things like this, especially here in British Columbia, but across Canada, as far as I know, we saw more of that come into effect. And so, of course, now lots of businesses are hopefully starting to catch up and understand that all public facing businesses and government facilities and everything are all beholden to this Canadian Accessibility Act, which means that, within reason, um, buildings now have to be wheelchair accessible at all, if at all possible, as things get modified. It's the same with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which came into effect, I believe, don't quote me on this, somewhere in the late 70s, early 80s. Um, I just remember there was a lot, that was back when there was a lot of protests and pushing for it, and then it came into effect. So somewhere around there.
Hmm.
So like Canada's well behind in that respect, but I've been fighting with McDonald's because they have these wonderful displays which show when your order is coming up. And so you don't have to hear amongst all of the noise that, somebody's shouting your name or your order number or etc. You should be able to see it on the displays.
Mm.
But often lots of McDonald's um, will cancel out all of the orders at once because they want to make their times look shorter. Um,
Oh.
and so they'll like delete them all and then they'll just shout people's numbers out. And I've had to push for multiple McDonald's in this area to like stop doing that because a lot of deaf people or people with hearing disabilities have struggled with that. But then, of course, to recognize that other businesses don't even have a display system, like Starbucks or other places, you don't have a display. You just have to be able to hear your name or recognize when your order is up, right?
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they have this technology that sets them apart in some ways, and so I guess that's a good thing, but if they're not using it, what does it really matter? And they're not providing that accessibility that they have the ability to provide.
Yeah, so it's been a bit of a like me pushing them, and so they've gotten used to me being like, "Excuse me, I can't hear what when my order is up because it just disappeared."
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and it's
Mhm.
interesting too to think that the US has been ahead of us on this. When we like to think that Canada is so much more progressive than the US, especially these days. But it's important to remember that that's not always the case, and there's still a lot of work that we have to do here at home too.
Yeah.
Um, I know that we talked a little bit earlier about some of the things that people don't think about when it comes to hearing loss. Is there maybe a specific challenge that relates to your life that people without hearing loss wouldn't think about?
Oh, well, I mean, hmm, good question. So something that relates to my life that people without hearing loss might not think about. I've started using little bits of sign language while I'm talking to people. And so slowly people are starting to pick up on little signs. And because of course something, and if anybody here is listening to this or listening to this, maybe they're watching it with captions, who knows?
Hmm.
Um, Many people in the deaf community are familiar with how people around us tend to be like, "Oh, I really want to learn ASL." And it's just become a joke that, most hearing people say they want to learn ASL, and so most deaf people on YouTube or things are starting to be like, so I just tell friends, so go and do it.
Right.
Um, but uh, watch watch deaf creators, watch deaf movies. I think even something incredible is that Disney Plus, of all places, have started releasing some movies with sign language interpretation down in the corner.
Oh,
Because,
interesting.
of course, ASL is a different language, so captions don't always. People who grow up deaf or only speak ASL don't speak English. It doesn't mean that if somebody understands ASL that they will understand English because it is a different language, different different grammatical structure, etc. And so, hearing people often assume that all deaf people can read captions. So it's interesting that there are some movies being re-released with ASL interpretation and, um, but there's also starting to be more representation, just like there's starting to be more trans people and queer people represented in media and film. Same with deaf people, like where they're not the, it's kind of like any marginalized community, and you and I know this too. We want to see trans people in roles in media where they are not the point of the film, they just happen to be trans.
Hmm.
It's not like the whole plot revolves around them being trans. There just happened to be a trans person that was written kind of into the film without it being focused on them, or without it being like they're the butt of jokes or things like this, right? So, and deaf people and blind people and other people all want the same thing as well. We want representation. We want to see people so that, you know, when movies and TV and things are showing crowds of people, that it kind of reflects proportionality of if you took a random sample of the population, what you would see. Like, and that's really all anybody's looking for is to see, you know, that there are all different types of people, different abilities, represented in movies and TV and film and everything else so that we can have people growing up. Yeah, if I'd known about audio processing disorder when I was little, I might have, uh, and the people who supported me might not have kept sending me for hearing tests as a child, and I would pass the hearing tests, and then my parents would report to the teachers like, yeah, there's nothing wrong with her ears. but
Right.
there was. It's just the knowledge wasn't there. So,
Hmm.
we're getting there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is a conversation that seems like it happens in a variety of different communities, whether that's people with accessibility needs, whether it's trans people. And a lot of times you get that response of, well, this person's a really good actor, and so therefore they should get that role, even though they don't fit that demographic. Um, I'm guessing that there are a lot of people that, or I know there are a lot of people, at least in certain groups, that are losing out on opportunities because of that logic. Is that the case in the sort of hearing impairment community, if you could call it that?
Yeah, I mean, like, uh, I'm not sure if I understand exactly what you were saying. So who's lo I might have missed something. Who's losing out on opportunities?
I'm just thinking when it comes to let's use trans people as an
Sure.
example. There are actors that get cast in parts playing trans people that are not trans, and the logic that's used is, well, they're just a really good actor, and we don't have trans people that are really good actors that could do that instead.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's not necessarily true. But I'm wondering if the same sort of logic is being applied to people with hearing impairment, where they'll say, well, this person is going to, let's say, play a deaf individual because they're a
Sure.
really good actor, and sort of writing off the fact that there are, I would assume, people who are deaf that are very good actors as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't know for sure all of that, like all the instances, but like, um, because I do know that there have been some really good movies featuring deaf actors. Um, however, I mean, it stands to reason that I think, um, sometimes because of how, deaf, people, use, ASL and facial expressions and everything else, it sometimes is easier to make somebody to bring in a deaf actor. However, also I could see it would make perfect, um, well, logic to directors when if they want to be, um, if they don't have somebody who does is deaf who they want to act. Or I mean, let's face it, I think the most common reason why people find it difficult, probably and I am hypothesizing here, to find, deaf actors is probably because of ableism in their on their side, where they would want to be able to, kind of just shout and talk and things like this and not have to take extra steps and stuff. So it would make sense, but I must say, I don't know for sure. I'm just kind of guessing based on
Right.
what I do know. Um, and it's only within the past year that I have, um, been learning myself about what's out there and stuff. And that's the problem is, we've got a lot of the times the deaf community, um, and the hearing community haven't always intersected. And, until 1860 until 1960, signing and the use of sign language in schools and educational institutions was banned.
Hmm.
And so, that was, 100 years of loss of development of culture on the deaf side. And, then, of course, like a lot of deaf people are born to hearing parents who force them to get cochlear implants or integrate into the hearing world instead of allowing them to just be deaf with a capital D, and as in like cultural community and everything else, right? And so
Hmm.
we're only starting, fairly recently, to really allow people to choose themselves as to, like, what happens, whether they want to have cochlear implants and try to integrate into the hearing world, or, be deaf and develop their their own culture. And, so, um, long story short, basically, I don't think there has historically been a lot of overlap between the hearing, and deaf communities. I mean, I use community for hearing as in like everybody other than the deaf community, unfortunately. So yeah, yeah.
Right. So I'm curious to know how well schools and workplaces typically support people with hearing impairments. Do you have some good or not so good examples that you can share that you've witnessed?
Colleges and universities are starting to be better with this, but also a lot of the times they don't have enough interpreters or transcribers or people available. So like sometimes you'll have a class and they'll be like, Sorry, we don't have somebody available for that class."
Mm.
Um, so you'll have to kind of wing it. And I'm lucky I have a microphone that's connected to my hearing aids that I can make people wear. So like because I'm not yet completely deaf. So, I am lucky in that respect that I do have alternatives, but I still, it's always going to be harder, especially with the audio processing disorder.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, like in the public school system, it's it's even worse because of course, like parents and teachers are requesting EAs, they're requesting interpreters, they're requesting all sorts of things, and there aren't enough. It's like, oh, well, I need to put my child into a deaf school so that and then of course there's long waits for those. I think there's only I'm not sure exactly, but I know there's only a couple in BC that are official deaf schools,
Right.
elementary and high schools, right?
So they
There's
might
one
not
in
be
Burnaby.
convenient.
Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
there's one in Burnaby. I think there's one in Vancouver in the West End, but I'm not sure. Um, and yeah, so not a lot.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And you can always tell where there's a deaf school or a deaf community because there will be a deaf sign for that city. And it's interesting
oh,
because then otherwise, when there is no deaf sign for a city, you just fingerspell it, right? In ASL
oh, okay.
instead of actually making a like Vancouver is this and Victoria is like down. Um, so like you can tell that there's a deaf community in cities with a deaf sign, but other cities that don't have a deaf sign, you can usually tell that's why that yeah, they don't have one.
Oh, interesting. Yeah,
Yeah.
one of
Yeah.
those things that you just wouldn't think about if you're
Yeah.
hearing, or someone who doesn't, struggle with hearing loss.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how big of a role we talked about ASL and how you're sort of using it now in some
Mhm.
ways, or when you're talking at sometimes. How big of a role does sign language play in your life, or how big of a role do you see it playing? What is that process like for you of learning that and communicating with
Yeah.
other people using ASL? Is that
Well, I mean, like I've just been starting to learn myself, and
right?
I took a course at UVic, and like just trying to learn as much as I can, just in case my hearing loss continues.
Mhm.
Um, um, but also like I tried to look up resources for hearing loss, like middle of life, and I could tell you there's either, resources for parents whose children or deaf, or, hearing loss early in life or hearing loss late in life.
Mm.
Nothing in between
Right.
because it's not as common, right? Yeah.
Mhm. And I
Yeah.
guess on that note, what advice would you give to someone who's maybe just starting to navigate life with hearing loss, or what would you recommend to their friends and family who are trying to figure out how to navigate that?
Yeah, there's resources. Um um there's on Vancouver Island, there's Island Deaf and Hard of Hearing. On the mainland, I know there's something called Deaf Wellbeing. There are other organizations. There's the overall Canadian Hard of Hearing Association, I think. Yes, Canadian Hard of Hearing Association. And then of course, so there's lots and lots of organizations, thankfully, that you can reach out to and gain some resources. Again, there's less resources about audio processing disorder. Also,
Mm.
I will say for anybody looking into audio processing disorder, not all audiologists are trained to diagnose audio processing disorder. Most of them will just put you through the tests for hearing loss. You have to find an audiologist who is trained in audio processing disorder as well, and they'll put you through extra tests where you will listen to, people talking over each other, or, people saying two words at the same time, or people talking with loud crowds in the background, and they'll then ask you what they said and things. And for me, it just felt like nails on a chalkboard. I couldn't
Mm,
at all. So,
right.
um, but like, yeah, so you have to seek somebody out who's qualified with that. Basically, there's lots of resources for hearing loss and deafness or hard of hearing. There's fewer for audio processing disorder, but they are out there as well.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. Uh,
Yeah.
and is there a specific moment or experience that sort of stuck with you that showcases why accessibility and or empathy matters?
Oh, well, I mean, like accessibility and empathy make a huge difference for any marginalized community or people. Like,
Hmm.
you know, um, um, just like we know for trans people and queer people, and it's the same for like hard of hearing, audio processing disorder, people with visual impairments, all types of accessibility matters. It means and empathy matters because it's the difference between at least having other people understand what you're going, or try to understand what you're going through, or at least be willing to, you know, meet you part way, or try to meet you where you're at,
Hmm.
versus people who just, can't understand and won't even try.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, I guess I'm trying to relate this to
yeah, yeah.
someone who is maybe experiencing a situation where they're going to clue in and go, "Oh, right, that's why this matters." And I'm wondering if you've had one of those moments where maybe you've seen someone that's being mistreated or um, someone who's just struggling unnecessarily. Maybe you've experienced that yourself, and you can just provide sort of an example to someone of why that's
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
important.
Well, I mean, I definitely wouldn't have struggled as much in school if people had actually known, after, because I got hearing tests pretty much every few years throughout all of elementary and high school.
Mhm.
And teachers would then demand that my parents did it again and again and again. And every time it was like, yes, physical hearing is fine. And then, it's become apparent the more I talk to people who I go, yes, I've been diagnosed with audio processing disorder, and they ask what it is. And then they go, oh my goodness, I struggle with that. Like
Mm.
I can't stand noises that overlap with each other. I can't, understand people, what do we call speech in noise, like people talking in a crowded environment. And I go, well, there's not a lot of known about audio processing disorder, so you might have it. You can pursue it and go check it out.
Mhm.
Um, at worst, you get the test and you're fine.
Right.
But it's worth it to at least to know that it exists. Just like we benefited from finally knowing that trans people exist, and being able to um, that then lead us to go, oh, click, that's a thing, right?
Mhm. You need
If
that
I'd known that
introductory
trans
moment.
people existed when I was a child, it would have been so much different. Same with audio processing disorder, same with anything. Knowledge is power.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I think that's probably very relatable to a lot of people. I mean, obviously,
yeah,
being trans myself, I relate to
yeah,
that fact that if I'd known about this earlier, it would have made my life a lot easier, and I'm sure that applies to
yeah.
many other things in life as well.
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm.
So spreading information and getting the word out is hopefully going to help people go, oh my goodness, nobody ever told me that this was a thing, and this would make so much sense. And then, it's like we say sometimes, there's people saying, we don't need labels, but also there's a need for labels a lot of the time, because without them, you can just go, end up thinking like, what, there must just be something wrong with me that I just have to live with. I don't, you know.
Hmm.
Sometimes a label can just give you a, a path to go down to find solutions and resources and things that help. It's not necessarily about the label, but the label gives you clues to go and which direction to go in, and also ways to explain, you know, to those around you, oh, well, I, this is why I've been struggling. And then other people can like, um, you know, make more sense. Now my partner doesn't think that I'm just ignoring them, you
Right.
know? Um, so explanations matter. Labels do matter sometimes, and they're incredibly validating. So, even just finally, no, some people only seek diagnoses just to be validated in their experience. And then, like, even if they don't have to do anything else about it, just having that label and being like, oh, well, that explains everything. I'm not just like, either making this up or who knows what.
Hmm.
We all tell ourselves like, yeah,
Right.
yeah. So, sometimes it's even just about the validation that you get with, all of this now makes sense. It all clicks into place.
Hmm.
It validates my experience, and it also even gives me a direction to go and seek resources with.
Right. And
Yeah.
so when people say, why are labels important? It's not so much the label that's important, it's the access to information that you get from having that label.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It's like it points you in the right direction,
right.
at least. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm getting close to the end of my questions at the moment. Is there anything
Yeah.
else that we haven't talked about as it relates to this subject that you think would be important to share?
I think it's really important for everybody to try. I know that it's difficult. Just try, understand that not all disabilities are visible. It's easy to just kind of write things off as, oh, this person, has this intention or that intention or doesn't care or this or that, or,
Hmm.
there's lots and lots. Our human brains are always trying to fill in blanks, and that is where judgments come from. But if we work to try and balance that out with keeping an open mind and saying, well, maybe this person's experience isn't known to me. Maybe there's other things that I'm not familiar with, or, um, you know, and learning to ask people for what they need, or things like this instead of assuming all of this stuff. So
Right.
it's really helpful, the Hidden Disabilities campaign, the Hidden Disabilities Sunflower, that's going to help because lots of hidden disabilities need a visual cue because we're human beings that like to make sense of our world. And so
Mhm.
if we see something that doesn't make sense, we're going to sometimes, without even meaning to, use a judgment to fill in a gap.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
And it sounds like we're moving toward a more accessible future. What are you
yes.
hoping that future looks like?
I I have so many hopes. I hope that healthcare and community and education and understanding all increase. Like, that people gain knowledge of all of the different experiences. I've often said sometimes for hearing loss, it can be even sometimes more difficult to only hear part of something than to just not either hear it perfectly or not hear it at all. Sometimes it can be really difficult on the brain. Um, but yeah, my hope for the future is that like awareness, education, and also like healthcare and options increase for people, and that we work towards a future where lots of different experiences and all are understood as much as we can. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, I hope for
And
that
I think,
future as well.
yeah, exactly. The Canadians with Disabilities Act, or Canadian Accessibility Act, sorry, is hopefully going to become more known and
Hmm.
slowly work its way into society and culture to kind of bring attention to that too. Yeah.
Right. And what do you think our audience can do to help us get to that future?
Look it up yourself. Go look at the Hidden Disabilities Sunflower campaign. Go look up the Canadians with our Canadian Accessibility Act. And look at look at more ways to be accessible in everyday life or with people around you, or just listen to what people need if they tell you in various verbal or nonverbal ways.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining the podcast and,
Yes,
and
thank
having this
you.
conversation.
Yeah.
This has been a social justice podcast. I'm your host, Nicola Spurling, and today I've been joined by Vee Greer for a conversation about hearing impairment. You've been listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, brought to you by NES Design and Construction and hosted by Nicola Spurling on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples.